So I think that we need to understand that there is, in our legacy of dance, what we have so many options and so many models for really complex communication, where there is meaning on many levels at once, and that we need to take that into our own contemporary dance, to be brave enough and to be playful enough to find ways to take these meanings forward.
I think the thing about the historical work that I'm understanding is that, like Nijinsky and like Noverre, that these choreographers draw upon certain symbols or certain icons from the past that give their new work strength and depth. And that for contemporary choreographers to understand and play with these symbols in their own way and make their own statement today would be a way of not only honoring the past, but it would also be a way of giving a depth to the structure of the choreography.
So give me an example. How can someone do that? So well, I'm a young choreographer.
Okay, well if you're
tell me how.
Okay. Well,
pretend I'm a young choreographer.
All right. Well, you're always young at heart. So
there we go.
Yeah. Well, let's just take these patterns. You know, for instance, like there are these quadrille patterns in social dance where you have rectangles, not only rectangles and squares, and certain spirals going on, but it's like a kaleidoscope. So that the space is kind of fractured. It turns around. It gets remade. It goes apart. It comes back again. And I think that the effect of playing with that sort of those geometrical patterns in space, the idea that they can break apart, maybe suddenly it becomes chaotic, but then it gets formed again, is a beautiful metaphor for life. It's like, because life changes, it's something that's unexpected, and then we put it back into a form, and then it breaks that form. So a young choreographer could take these notations, just as Diaghilev showed Messine and showed Nijinsky these patterns from these notation books that had, you know, all the geometry. A contemporary choreographer from today could play with those same shapes. And what those shapes do is it has to do with parting, coming together. There's a sense of community. There's a sense of chaos, but there's a balance in the geometry that has a pleasing effect. And once you understand what those are, like the circle of death, or it could be the circle of life. It could be, you know, the fighting diagonals of the square, or it could be like, you know, you're there and you're at you're at the corners of the square, but instead of taking a straight diagonal, you take, you know, a kind of meandering path, a little spiral path to get there. That means something totally different than if it's a direct path. Mm. So once the contemporary choreographers start thinking like this, they can sort of explode the possibilities of that code. And that's also, you know, reflected to contemplations about the way the stars move, the way the planets move, retrograde, you know, going ahead, what the pull is, what the orbit is, what the tension is in the orbit, keeping everything balanced. And the idea that things are balanced, that there's some kind of, you know, polarization of extremes and you go onto those different levels. That kind of thought process is very much a part of, I think, how human beings build societies, or how they build their family, or sometimes even how they physically build a place to live in. So I think that the more sensitive a contemporary choreographer is to these basics, you can reach your audience in a nonverbal level, and maybe a molecular level, maybe a DNA level. Mm-hmm. Who knows? But I think that you know, that it offers possibilities.
I think that's a really interesting thing because, of course, the work on the Rite of Spring, I'm so involved in ground patterns, not just because of the shamanistic sources, but because I feel that Nijinsky really understood a whole new way of using the corps de ballet. Mm. And in fact, his sister Bronislava writes about the fact that the dancers from the Imperial Ballet that were in Diaghilev's company that danced the Rite of Spring were really troubled by the fact that Nijinsky would move masses across, and they would be working in tightly formed groups instead of long, beautiful lines.
Right.
And in these gracious and well-balanced geometrical figures. It was quite sometimes off-center and disturbing for them, but it was nonetheless ground patterns.
Right.
And these were accumulating energy, but there is something extraordinary, you know, like for example in this phenomenon of crop circles.
Yes.
These patterns that are like formed somehow in the ground by whatever means, and earthworks where you see large patterns in space. And that maybe dance has lost that a bit.
Maybe it's lost its spatial...
Maybe it's lost that connection, that archetypal connection to nature.
Yeah, yeah.
Or not even to nature, I mean like why we can't use architecture. You know, that I don't mean necessarily even Frank Lloyd Wright, but like Renzo Piano, like look at a piece of architecture now and say, I want to take that grid of the elevation of made for that building, that model, and I think I can turn that into movement. And that's our time. That's real structure in time and place.
Right.
And that could affect people.
Right.
That has, because it's connected inside with our time. So I think we have kind of lost a kind of grandeur in dance because we've lost the ground patterns.
I think it's not only the ground patterns, but I'm thinking that, again, if you think of the Vitruvian Man, you know, where he's standing in an X and then he's standing a little bit more in a square. If you look at it, it's like everything is going out from the center and then pressing out through the space through his limbs. But
and everything is
Vitruvian,
alive and all, up and down.
in all directions, yeah.
Yes.
But the description of it is that man is a reflection of the universe, that man is a microcosm of the macrocosm. So at that time, and I think with also Nijinsky, they're looking at man in relationship to nature, man in relationship to the universe. And I think that when people feel disconnected from the universe or disconnected from nature, that it's I don't know, it's less, because you can't feel
it loses the dimension.
You can't feel the strength within you. You can't feel the divinity within you, or you can't. There's a, you know, if you there's a sense of a spiritual world. It's hard to feel that sense of the spirit if you don't believe in a spirit or a dream.
I have seen some contemporary work that really does capture that.
Ah, okay. Yes, yes.
I'm a big fan of Akram Khan, for example, and I think in some of his pieces he has like this larger picture of society that's condensed down into the body.
Yes.
Or from the body out into the larger society. I think he's doing that. I mean, some people are doing that, but if we're thinking of working with students that come to us,
right,
to encourage them in these directions that give them more support,
right,
internally and externally, but to work with the material world.
Yes.
Somehow, to work with the material world with a spiritual or a psychological point of view.
One thing that came up in our discussions was we were talking to Doug Foolington, and he was talking about how the choreographers in Russia at the time of Nijinsky all notated. They all knew Stepanov notation. They notated their dances. And then we started talking about notation as being another way to experience dance. And you were talking about Nijinsky being in house arrest, and that he could feel like he was dancing when he was making these notes for his dances or these drawings for his dances.
And even later when he was in Switzerland. Yes,
yeah,
absolutely. That was his way of dancing.
And I think that this idea, you know, if we could somehow explain this to younger dancers, this kind of relationship to dance in another form, in a written form, whether it's through drawings and symbols, or whether it's through lava notation or Stepanov notation or Fouillé notation, that it brings dance to another level, and then it makes you think about it in a different way, and it makes the analysis different. And as soon as you get like another layer, or you get a deeper layer, you get another dimension, I think it stimulates creativity, and it allows you to experience dance in everyday life. It allows you to see it, to recognize it in a way. the way the moth goes. We were talking about moths at that
Oh,
one
yes,
point.
like
I mean, do you want to talk
Yeah, it
about
was,
that?
like, when he was working, the idea for Jeu first came when he was sitting in this cafe in the Bois de Boulogne, I think. And he saw moths fluttering around a candlelight. And it just reminded him of young people flirting and playing games with each other. And that then attached to the idea of tennis, people in white playing tennis. And then the idea of the games that people were playing being deeper games. And that the garden that they were dancing in is this pleasure garden, that beautiful Belle Epoque world that was so threatened, and it was
Right.
the pleasure garden was threatened, so that the connection with nature is there, but the connection with nature is threatened.
Right, exactly.
And so all relationships were threatened. So it's just so rich to work from an image outward.
Yes, yes.
I think that is sort of where the thrust comes from.
There's also, like, since we're talking about moths, I guess I have to talk about the birds. Because there's a story about Beauchamp sitting, down and watching the birds fly, watching how they fly, and how they sort of like all follow each other in a V, and then they go like this, and how that
patterns,
and how that inspired his choreography, and so it just reminded me of the moths,
Some of the earliest postmodern dancers worked on bird mutations, like change, some I think it's swallows have no leader.
Oh,
And they it'll be kind of a mutation pattern. Somebody else will change, and then they'll all follow, and somebody else will change. So they actually, it's like a sort of anarchistic society.
wow.
Swallows.
Well, many things to think about with
Yes.
nature.